the Crimea annexation certainly changed the equation for the relationship. Russia was willing to give China a series of things that it had not before, whether it was advanced weapons sales, the scope for investments in Russia, or some of the big energy deals that it hadn't been willing to do in the past. And so in a certain sense, you had a development in the relations from after the Crimea annexation that continued to head in one direction, where the no limits joint statement between the two parties was almost the culmination of that. But the war has, of course, changed the balance of these dynamics. China's had to be more careful in certain areas. Even after 2014, China was always careful when it came to sanctions enforcement, given that they don't want their own companies to fall foul of secondary sanctions, particularly in the technology sector. What you've in practice seen is, in the last year, a deepening of the economic relationship. Trade has increased markedly, primarily in energy, but also in terms of the supplies that China's provided in some more targeted areas, such as semiconductors and a few other fields. Diplomatically, China has, at the same time as providing certain forms of clear support to the Russian position, signaling its sympathies for Russia's the situation that it believes Russia found itself in, this concept of a big country being pushed against the wall, which is the same way that China sees itself, blaming the United States, blaming NATO expansion for the war. They've still also had to placate various other parties, particularly the Europeans. There's been kind of an increasingly pronounced diplomatic dance on China's part as the war has played out, to try to signal some areas of distancing without actually translating any of that into anything that might help from a European perspective, such as actually putting pressure on Russia.
当地时间15号下午，国家主席习近平在撒马尔罕国宾馆同俄罗斯总统普京举行双边会见，就中俄问题交换意见。习近平指出，今年以来，中俄保持了卓有成效的战略沟通，两国各领域。
What we've already seen from China in the last period of time is willingness to provide all sorts of dual-use supplies. We've seen that with semiconductors, spare parts for fighter jets, helmets, vests, some satellite imagery, commercial drones. I mean, there's a number of areas in which China has still been willing to make certain transfers to Russia. I think the pressure has started to grow on the question of particularly artillery and ammunition. I think the pressure starts to come in with these resupply questions a year into the war, where, yes, China doesn't want to antagonize certain other countries, but it doesn't want to put Russia in a difficult position either. It certainly doesn't want to see Putin lose. It doesn't want to see Russia come out in an impaired position. And it doesn't necessarily want to be blamed for the fact that, where Russia has been willing to provide, advanced weaponry to China, in Russia's hour of need, is not even prepared to supply it with artillery. They know that this is a threshold crossing event, particularly the warnings that you've seen from the Europeans, but also from the United States. This would lead to a slew of sanctions. It would antagonize dynamics further. There would be a real cost to being seen in Europe as an enabler of security threats to Europe in such a direct way. And so evidently at the moment, they're weighing what the trade-offs around these questions look like.
В наступающем году интенсивные двухсторонние обмены продолжатся. Не сомневаюсь, что и мы найдем с вами возможность встретиться лично. Ждем вас, уважаемый господин председатель, дорогой друг, ждем вас весной следующего года с государственным визитом в Москву.
But they also, in the course of all of this, want to be seen to be a peace actor. That's part of the kind of placating job that China knows it needs to do. And it's notable, of course, that a lot of these efforts came not just around the anniversary of the invasion, but ahead of Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, which in ordinary circumstances is an extremely contentious visit, a visit that in another context without this kind of peace cover around it looks like Xi Jinping going to deepen and intensify ties with Russia on a whole series of different fronts. There are other forms of support that China has provided, certainly politically, but also in these kind of targeted economic means as well. And I think the visit will also include all these questions on the financial side as well. We've obviously seen the Russian economy turn towards China, not just when it comes to bilateral trade piece of things, but how to actually conduct some of this trade, the kind of renminbiization of some elements of the Russian economy. So it's very important for China's positioning on this, that they're able to sell this as kind of part of a push for a settlement, even if there isn't as yet very much indication that they're doing anything to bring that about. The position paper that they published was not anything that really resembled a peace plan. It was more of a regurgitation of rather standard Chinese positions on all of these things. It didn't propose any kind of indications on terms of territorial settlement or anything that would really have advanced the discussion in any meaningful way.
俄罗斯总统普京举行会谈，两国元首在热烈友好的气氛中，就中俄关系以及事关国际战略安全稳定的一系列重大问题深入充分交换了意见。习近平指出，2014年，我应普京总统邀请赴俄罗斯。
He's been much more personally invested in this relationship. It's described by some Chinese scholars as a kind of Russia complex on Xi Jinping's part. This seems to have some kind of familial ties as well. His father, Xi Jiangxun, went to the Soviet Union quite early on after the communists came to power to study and learn about the Soviet industry, political systems, and things. And it looks as if Xi Jinping was brought up in a context with high levels of respect for the Soviet Union values and a whole series of other Russia-related questions. They thought that the Crimea annexation was relatively successful. They thought that Russia's activities in Syria were relatively successful as well. There's been a certain amount of respect for these sort of lightning operations that that Putin has conducted. I think they've in some ways been disappointed and surprised by the failures of the war over the last year. I think they'd hoped and expected something different. I think there is a personal element to this, and there is an ideological element to it, but this is underpinned by a kind of strategic logic about the situation that the two sides seem to find themselves in, that has meant that they've been willing to overcome some of the differences that had precluded a closer relationship in the past.
习近平强调，当前全球新冠肺炎疫情仍在蔓延，世界进入新的动荡变革期，人类社会遭遇诸多挑战危机。中俄两国坚守初心，始终保持双边关系稳健前行。双方坚定支持彼此维护本国核心利益。
Xi Jinping has, of course, made a priority of going to Russia at almost every important juncture since he became General Secretary of the party. He made it his first overseas visit. He's visited Russia, met with Putin more than any other leader. Xi Jinping has been willing to do this in circumstances in which these meetings will look extremely contentious, will be politically problematic for them in various ways and for him. But he really affords value to this relationship. I think in the case of this visit, there's going to have to be a lot more of a delicate political signaling than than we've seen in some of these other exchanges. We saw that a little bit in Samarkand, where Putin at least was willing to play along with this a bit and signal that he understood China's concerns about the war. I think we'll see some elements in the visit that are focused on China's concerns for peace, and Putin and the Russian side will have to be willing to accommodate some elements of that political dance. And I think they particularly want to use the momentum in international public opinion that's come out of the Saudi-Iran deal. I think that's created the impression for some that China can play a certain kind of role on Russia and Ukraine, notwithstanding the fact that this is a fundamentally different situation. They want to find ways to give the impression that this is part of the peace diplomacy. And of course, most importantly, the thing that Xi Jinping had not been willing to do, which is to speak to Zelensky, it appears this will then take place after the visit.